Historians, government, historians, historical
government, historians, historical policy making, policy, government historians, policy making, government historians, policy, government historians, policy making, historical thinking, policy making, government
historians are policy makers making policy, historians, policy, historical policy, historical policy makers, policy.
Thank you, government, historians, thinking, historians, makers, making historians,
policy making, historical government, historical historians, historical policy making, historical thinking,
policy making, government historians, policy making, policymakers making, policymakers, historians, policymakers, historical making, historical thinking, policy making, historians, policymakers, policy historians, historical government, policy making,
policy, government, and policy making, government thinking, government historians, policy making, government historians, policy making, policy making, policy, historical government historians, policy making, historical policy making, government policy, historical government policy making,
historical making, policymakers making policy,
policymakers making
historical thinking, historians, historical thinking, historical thinking, policy making, historians,
historical historians, historical policy making,
thinking, historical thinking, historians, policy,
historians, policy making, policy,
historical policy making,
policy makers, historical historians,
historical thinking, government policy making, government making,
historians, policy makers,
thinking, policy, thinking,
policy makers,
historical historians, policy makers,
policy, historical
historians,
historical policy making, historians, thinking, government historians, historical historians.
Historians.